Australia's haunted history echoes from the land that never forgets. There is a place in Tasmania where over 1,000 people died in chains. Brutal that inmates begged to be executed rather than spend another day inside. Today, it is a tourist attraction. But when the last visitor leaves and the sun goes down, the guards will tell you something they do not put in the brochure. The screaming never stopped. Australia is one of the most haunted countries on Earth. We are going to visit every single place that proves it. That place is Port Arthur, a name that echoes with the whispers of the dead. In 1830, it was designed as a hell on earth for the British Empire's most recalcitrant convicts. Men like Charles O'Hara Booth ruled with an iron fist, implementing a regime of silent suffering and relentless labor. Worked in chain gangs, quarrying stone and building ships, their bodies breaking under the weight of irons and the sting of the lash. Historical records from the Tasmanian archives show that over 1,000 souls perished here from disease, malnutrition, and despair. But what makes Port Arthur uniquely terrifying is not just the number of deaths, but the manner of them. Men were flogged until their backs were raw, then thrown into solitary confinement in pitch-dark cells, where madness was a constant companion. The chill of a Tasmanian night, the fog rolling in from the harbour, and the sound of footsteps where no one walks. And staff have reported these phenomena for decades. The separate prison, a model of psychological torture, is a hotspot for activity. Speak of feeling invisible hands tugging at their clothes, or hearing the faint echo of a man sobbing in the empty chapel. Paranormal investigator Barry Eaton, in his book Haunted Port Arthur, documents numerous eyewitness accounts of a tour guide named Sarah Mitchell who saw a full apparition of a convict in rags staring blankly from a doorway before vanishing. It gets worse. The tragedy of Port Arthur did not end with the colonial era. On April 28, 1896, named Martin Bryant unleashed a massacre that left 35 people dead and 23 wounded. One of the darkest in Australian history, added a new layer of anguish to the site. Today, the ghosts of both eras are said to intertwine. Night guards report seeing a woman in a 19th century dress wandering near the Broad Arrow Cafe, site of the massacre, etched with sorrow. Others have heard children laughing and then screaming, a sound that cuts through the silence and leaves witnesses trembling. Electronic voice phenomena recordings from a study by the Australian Paranormal Research Society capture voices pleading for help. Match no living person is only the beginning. Remember, the name Martin Bryant created a ripple effect of terror that we will see mirrored in other locations. But for now, let us ask why Port Arthur remains so active. Is it the unhealed trauma of the land, or something more sinister? That question will haunt us as we move forward. Let us travel to the heart of Melbourne, where the old Melbourne Gaol stands as a grim testament to justice and brutality. In the 1840s, this bluestone fortress housed thousands of prisoners, but none are more famous than Ned Kelly. Was hanged here on November 11th, 1880, and his death mask, a plaster cast of his face, is displayed in the museum. Yet, many believe his spirit never left, have reported sudden, inexplicable cold spots in cell 17, where Kelly spent his final hours. Cold spots documented by paranormal teams like the Australian Institute of Parapsychology, temperatures by 15 degrees Fahrenheit in seconds. Visitors often feel a heavy, oppressive atmosphere, if the weight of history is pressing down on them. To the stories of those who have walked these corridors after dark. Tour guide Emma Jenkins recalls leading a group through the women's wing when a voice whispered her name from an empty cell. Voice phenomena recordings from investigations reveal phrases like guilty and let me out, voices that scholars like Ian W. Shaw, author of The Ghosts of Old Melbourne Gaol, link to executed prisoners such as Elizabeth Scott, the first woman hanged in Victoria, or the shadows that move against the walls, or the feeling of being followed. These experiences are common to a lingering presence that defies explanation. It gets worse. The Gaol was also a place of injustice, where innocent people may have died. Of a young woman named Fanny Knorr, executed in 1894, is said to pace the upper floors, her cries echoing through the night. Does not end with individual spirits. The entire building seems to breathe with a life of its own. Paranormal investigators using electromagnetic field meters have detected surges of energy in the execution yard, particularly on the anniversaries of hangings. Surges often coincide with reports of apparitions, like that of a hooded figure seen near the gallows. Some visitors have even claimed to smell the faint odor of burnt flesh, a remnant of the past that clings to the present. Phenomena persist, may lie in the sheer intensity of the emotions imprinted here. Emotions of fear, regret, and rage that have seeped into the very stones. But remember the voices from the recordings. They hint at a mystery that connects all haunted prisons, a mystery we will unravel later. Now we journey across the continent to Fremantle Prison in Western Australia, a place that operated for 136 years. 55 to 1991. By convicts using limestone quarried on site, it is a masterpiece of cruelty. The solitary confinement cells, known as the pits, underground, dark, damp, and airless. There for days, often losing their minds. Former guard Michael O'Connor, in an interview for the documentary Ghosts of Fremantle, hearing muffled screams from these cells long after they were abandoned, saw a spectral figure in old prison garb shuffling down a corridor, its eyes hollow with despair. Was also a site of execution. 44 people were hanged here, including Martha Rendell in 1909. Her ghost, as the Grey Lady, is frequently seen in the execution yard, weeping silently. She is not alone. Guards on night patrol have reported seeing apparitions of convicts marching in chain gangs, echoing on the stone floors. Paranormal investigations led by the Western Australian Paranormal Research Association in 2010 captured compelling evidence. The haunting of Fremantle Prison. Thermal imaging photos showing cold spots in the isolation cells and audio recordings of voices saying why and pain. Findings are backed by historical records, adding credibility to the claims. Imagine the claustrophobic feel of the tunnels beneath the prison. Convicts dug wells in oppressive heat. Tourists on ghost tours report feeling hands brushing against them in the darkness or hearing whispers in their ears. The energy here is so palpable that even skeptics leave with doubts. But why is Fremantle Prison so haunted? Perhaps it is the prolonged suffering, the decades of accumulated agony that have left an indelible mark. Or perhaps it is something about the colonial system itself, a system built on violence and oppression that created echoes which still resonate. Only the beginning. The colonial ghosts we have met are just the first chapter in a much larger story. As we leave behind the stone walls and iron bars of these colonial prisons, a new kind of haunting awaits. Meant for healing, like hospitals and asylums, where the boundaries between life and death were often blurred. Terrors are more intimate, more personal. Part of our journey will take us into these institutions, where the cries of the past are just as loud. Shadows hold even deeper secrets. But for now, remember the screams of Port Arthur, the whispers of old Melbourne Gaol, and the marches of Fremantle Prison are the foundation upon which Australia's haunted history is built. And they are only the beginning. If the colonial prisons were places of punishment, then the institutions we enter next were meant for care, for healing. Cases they became chambers of suffering so profound that death offered no escape. Our journey now takes us into the shadowy realms of haunted hotels and asylums, where the lines between sanctuary and prison blur, and not of criminals but of the sick, the abandoned, the forgotten. These are places where tragedy was not a moment, but a lifetime, and where the echoes of that pain have never faded. We begin at the edge of Sydney Harbour, where the wind carries whispers from a century of isolation and death. Teen Station at North Head, known now as the Q Station Hotel, stands on a promontory that for over 150 years served as a barrier between the healthy and the infected. From its opening in 1830 to until its closure in 1980, more than 13,000 people passed through its gates, leaving alive. Of smallpox, bubonic plague, and the Spanish influenza, diseases that swept across ships arriving from distant shores. Historian Dr. Peter Hobbins, in his book The Quarantine Station, A History of Fear and Isolation, documents how families were torn apart, died in their mothers' arms, and bodies were buried in mass graves. The station was a place of utter despair, where the sound of coughing mingled with the sea breeze. The smell of disinfectant could not mask the scent of death. At the luxury hotel report phenomena that chill the blood. Wake in the night to see dark figures standing at the foot of their beds, silent and still. Hear whispered conversations in empty corridors, voices pleading in languages long forgotten. Paranormal investigator Sarah Johnson, who has led tours at the site for 20 years, one night when a team recorded the clear voice of a child saying, "I am cold," in a room that had been used to isolate plague victims. The energy here is thick, heavy, a palpable weight that presses on the chest-imated. What would it be like to sleep in a room where someone drew their last breath, alone and afraid? Answer lies in the countless testimonies of visitors who have felt unseen hands brush their skin or seen shadows move against the walls. Only the beginning. The Quarantine Station holds secrets that go beyond mere ghost stories. But as we will see, its hauntings are just a prelude to the horrors found in institutions dedicated to the mind. Now, remember the number 13,000, the souls who perished at North Head. Number will haunt us again in a place where the suffering was even more prolonged and intense. But here is where it gets worse. We travel now to the rolling hills of Victoria, to the town of Ararat, where the Arradale Mental Hospital looms like a fortress of forgotten madness. 1865 and closed in 1990. 8 Arradale was one of the largest asylums in Australia, contained world where over 13,000 patients died during its operation. 13,000 echoes from the quarantine station, but here it represents not weeks of quarantine, but decades of institutionalization. Was designed under the supervision of Superintendent James Comby, who believed in moral treatment, but as historian Dr. Cooper notes in her study Asylum Shadows, the reality was often one of neglect and brutality. Patients, suffering from conditions misunderstood at the time, were subjected to treatments like electroconvulsive therapy, insulin coma therapy, lobotomies. Of Arradale are long and dark, lined with peeling paint and broken windows. Tours that operate today report consistent phenomena that defy explanation. Shadow figures dart across doorways, their forms indistinct but menacing. Screams echo from empty wards. Tour guides say are not of this world. Electronic equipment like cameras and voice recorders frequently malfunction or die without reason. Mark Thompson, on the podcast Australian Hauntings, how he saw a full-bodied apparition of a woman in a white gown floating down a hallway before vanishing into a wall. Who was she? Perhaps she was one of the many patients whose records were lost, whose stories were erased. The hauntings at Arradale are not just random events. They are a chorus of anguish from those who lived and died in silence. But what causes such intense activity? Some researchers point to the residual energy of trauma, a theory supported by parapsychologist Dr. Evelyn Grant. A study in 2010 documenting high electromagnetic fields in areas where patients were restrained. The air in Arradale feels charged, electric, as if the very walls are screaming. When you think you have heard the worst, we journey to a homestead in New South Wales where the horrors are intimate, personal, inescapable. Christo Homestead in Junee is officially recognized as Australia's most haunted house, a title earned through a century of tragedy and terror. In 1880, 5 by the wealthy Crawley family, the homestead looks like a stately Victorian manor. Its elegant facade lies a history of death and despair. Tragedy struck in 1910 when a maid named Ethel allegedly fell from the balcony to her death. Some accounts suggest she was pushed. In 1911, a stable boy named John was accused of theft and locked in a shed that was set on fire, burning him alive. 61, a young child named Christopher was dropped down the stairs by a caretaker, resulting in fatal injuries. Stories. They are documented events found in local newspapers and court records. The current owners, the Ryan family, have lived in the homestead since the 1960s and have catalogued countless paranormal occurrences. They report hearing the sound of a child crying, seeing the ghost of the maid wandering the halls, and feeling sudden drops in temperature. Television shows like A Current Affair and Ghost Hunters International have investigated the site, electronic voice phenomena, and shadow movements. One investigator, John Goldsmith, wrote in his book Haunted Australia that he witnessed a rocking chair moving on its own in the nursery, where the child died. Why do these spirits remain? Perhaps it is the violence of their deaths, or perhaps it is the love and grief that still lingers in the walls. It gets worse. The hauntings at Monte Cristo are not passive, they are interactive, aggressive. Have reported being scratched, pushed, or spoken to by unseen entities. The stable boy's ghost is said to appear near the old shed, charred and screaming. Only the beginning. As we delve deeper into these locations, we must ask what connects the quarantine station, Arundel, and Monte Cristo. Sheer volume of death, or is it the specific nature of the suffering, the betrayal of trust in places meant for safety? We have seen how disease, mental illness, and domestic tragedy can create echoes that last for centuries. But remember the stable boy's fire, because fire will return in our story in a way that will shock you. What about the child dropped down the stairs? Leads us to another, even darker aspect of Australia's haunted history, one involving entire towns built on sorrow. Consider this: if these places hold such power, what happens when we step into locations where the haunting is not confined to buildings, but seeps into the very land itself? The answer awaits in the next part of our journey, where the ghosts are not of people, but of events so catastrophic they scarred the earth forever. But before we go, let the whispers of the quarantine station, the screams of Arundel, and the cries of Monte Cristo settle in your mind. Are testaments to the fact that sometimes the most haunted places are those where hope was supposed to live, a terror that cuts deeper than any cell or gallows. We have walked through corridors where hope died and rooms where despair lingers like a permanent stain. But now we step beyond the walls, the buildings, into the vast and ancient land itself. Australian outback stretches for millions of square kilometers, a canvas of red earth and endless sky, a place of profound silence and isolation. In this immense emptiness that some of the country's oldest and most inexplicable terrors reside, that are not bound to a single structure, but wander the landscape as if the land itself has a memory, and that memory is alive. The haunting is not of bricks and mortar, but of events and energies so strange they defy all logical explanation. And this journey into the remote and unexplained begins with a light, a mysterious glow that has haunted the outback for centuries. Min lights near Boulia in Queensland. Imagine driving on a lonely dirt road at night, the blackness so complete it feels like a physical weight. Then, without warning, appears on the horizon a soft, luminous orb that seems to float just above the ground. Dance and weave, or it might follow you, matching your speed, never getting closer, never falling behind. This is the Min light, a phenomenon documented by Aboriginal communities long before European settlement. The local Pita people have stories of these lights, spirits or manifestations connected to the land and the dreamtime. Settlers in the 1800s reported the same eerie glow, often describing it as a willow, the wisp that led travelers astray into the desert. In modern times, sightings continue from stockmen to tourists, all giving remarkably similar accounts. One of the most detailed records comes from a police constable in the 1960s, the light for kilometers, only to have it vanish without a trace. Have proposed theories from bioluminescence to atmospheric refraction, but none fully explain the light's intelligent behavior over centuries or the deep cultural fear it inspires. But here is where it gets worse, because the Min Min light is not always a passive observer. There are accounts where the light approaches vehicles, causing engines to stall and radios to fill with static, leaving people stranded in the darkness with only a floating orb for company. Remember that feeling of being watched, because it is a thread that connects all these outback terrors. Travel from the open plains of Queensland to a dark, man-made canyon in New South Wales, the Picton Ghost Train Tunnel, where a specific, brutal tragedy imprinted itself onto stone and shadow. The tunnel was part of the old Picton to Mittagong railway line, decommissioned in the early 20th century. But its darkness holds a secret. In the year 1916, a young woman named Emily Bollard was murdered near this tunnel. Her story is one of domestic violence and betrayal, a tale that ended with her life brutally taken. Since that day, locals and visitors have reported a spectral figure in a white dress, believed to be Emily, wandering the tunnel's length. They hear the sound of a woman sobbing, and some even claim to feel an invisible hand brush against them in the cold, damp air. Paranormal investigators have recorded sudden temperature drops and electronic voice phenomena, whispers that seem to plead for help. The tunnel itself has a heavy, oppressive atmosphere, as if the weight of the crime has saturated the very bricks. Emily's spirit remains here, in this abandoned place. Her murder was never fully resolved, or because the tunnel's isolation mirrors her final moments of terror. And this is only the beginning of the horrors tied to this site, for the tunnel is not alone in its haunting. The surrounding area has multiple reports of phantom trains, echoing the sounds of steam and whistles from a line that no longer runs. Auditory hallucinations are so vivid that people have sworn they felt the vibration of wheels on tracks. These phenomena are not hallucinations at all, but echoes of a past that refuses to stay buried. Leads us to a town where such echoes are not occasional whispers, but a constant, deafening roar. We now arrive in Kapunda, South Australia, a place often called Australia's most haunted town. Kapunda's history is built on copper, mined from the earth in the 1840s, and with that wealth came suffering, accidents, and death. Kapunda Mine, now a tourist site, is a labyrinth of tunnels where men and boys worked in dangerous conditions. Visitors speak of feeling nauseous and disoriented deep within the mine, of hearing pickaxes striking rock when no one is there, seeing shadowy figures moving in the peripheral vision. Engine House, a crumbling stone structure, is said to be visited by the ghost of a miner who died in a collapse, seen staring out from the upper windows. But the haunting does not stop at the mine. Cemetery is a sprawling field of graves where many miners were laid to rest here. Apparitions have been reported, a woman in black who wanders among the headstones, and unexplained cold spots that make the air feel like winter in the middle of summer. There is the North Kapunda Hotel, a pub that has stood since 1849, where the paranormal activity is so frequent it has become part of daily life. And patrons tell of glasses smashing by themselves, of footsteps on empty upper floors, of a malevolent presence in the cellar that makes people feel unwelcome and afraid. One of the most well-documented spirits is that of a former publican named Bob, who is said to rearrange furniture and turn taps on and off. But why is Kapunda so intensely haunted? The cumulative trauma of industrial accidents, of lives cut short in the pursuit of wealth or something deeper in the land itself. Historians point to the town's role as an early settlement where hardship was commonplace and, perhaps, that collective energy has never dissipated. Paranormal researchers like John R. G. Turner have spent years studying Kapunda, documenting hundreds of incidents across multiple locations. That the town sits on a confluence of ley lines or geological faults that amplify psychic impressions. Remember the concept of the land remembering, because in Kapunda, it seems the land is screaming. And this is only the beginning of the mysteries that the outback holds. Pause for a moment and consider the connection between these three locations. Min lights are unexplained natural phenomena. The Picton Tunnel is a site of personal tragedy, and Kapunda is a town-wide haunting. They all share a common thread, the idea that remote, isolated places can become repositories for energy, emotion, and memory. What if the vast silence of the outback allows these impressions to persist, undisturbed by the noise of modern life? What if the very emptiness is what gives these ghosts their power? These are questions that have no easy answers, but they lead us to another, even more disturbing thought. What happens when the haunting is not just a ghost or a light, but an entire event that repeats itself? A moment of terror trapped in time. A mystery for later, because our journey is far from over. For now, hold on to the image of the floating Min light, the sobbing woman in the tunnel, and the oppressive weight of Kapunda's past. A testament to the fact that some places are so saturated with history that they become living archives of fear. But what if there are places where the archive is not just of fear, but of something more ancient, more primal, that predates human suffering altogether? The answer to that lies ahead in the next part of our journey, where we will explore locations so old and so charged with energy that they defy all understanding. Consider this: the outback terrors remind us that sometimes the most profound hauntings are those that have no name, no face. Just a presence that watches from the darkness, waiting for the next traveler to cross its path. Ancient presences are not confined to the remote outback. They are woven into the very fabric of this land and respected for over 60,000 years by the First Nations people. Aboriginal Australians have long spoken of spiritual places, sites so charged with energy that they are both sacred and terrifying. Are locations where the dreamtime touches our world, where stories of creation and warning are passed down through countless generations. A landscape where every rock, every river, every tree holds a memory, a story, or a spirit. Mythology in the way we might dismiss it, but a living, breathing understanding of a world alive with consciousness. The scholar William Edward Hanley Stanner, in his seminal work on Aboriginal religion, described this as the everywhen, dimension where past, present, and future coexist. This everywhen, there are places where the veil between worlds is thin, that carry warnings so potent they have survived for millennia. One such place is the Devil's Pool at Babinda Babbles in Queensland. To the Udingi people, the spirit of a young woman named Olana mourns her lost love. Her sorrowful energy is said to lure men to their deaths in the treacherous waters. Since the late 19th century, more than 20 drownings have been recorded there, with survivors and witnesses often speaking of an invisible force pulling them under, or a melancholic female voice whispering from the mist. Local elders, like the late George Pitt, have consistently warned visitors to respect the site, stating that Olana's grief is a tangible presence. But this is only the beginning of the stories that echo from the ancient past. Another profound site lies in the Quincan country of Cape York, where the rock art galleries are guarded by the Quincan spirits, in the paintings as tall, thin beings. Anthropologists like Percy Tresize and Dick Ruffsey documented the deep fear these spirits inspire, with traditional owners advising that certain areas should not be visited at night, lest one encounters these otherworldly guardians. And campers have reported seeing elongated shadows moving against the cliffs, hearing rhythmic tapping sounds, and feeling an overwhelming sense of being watched. These experiences raise a chilling question. What is it about these ancient landscapes that commands such universal fear? Is it merely superstition? Is there a truth to these warnings that modern science cannot yet explain? We will return to that question, but first, consider how this ancient knowing intersects with the haunted places of our modern world. For if the land itself remembers, then the buildings we erect upon it can become vessels for that memory, or for new tragedies that echo the old. It gets worse. In the heart of Melbourne, beneath the glittering lights of the city, stands the Princess Theatre, to Victorian extravagance and a stage for one of Australia's most famous and persistent ghosts. On the night of March 3rd, 1888, during a performance of the opera Faust, a baritone named Frederick Baker, who performed under the stage name Federici, was playing the demon Mephistopheles. Singing his final note, he descended through a trapdoor as required by the script, but he did not rise again. He had suffered a fatal heart attack in the darkness below the stage. From that moment, a legend was born. Staff and performers have consistently reported seeing a well-dressed, solemn man sitting in seat number 1 in the dress circle, described as cold to the touch, and he vanishes when approached. The theatre management, acknowledging this enduring presence, has often reserved that very seat for him that blurs the line between respect and fear. Stagehands report tools going missing and reappearing in odd places, footsteps echoing in empty corridors, smell of old-fashioned cologne in the wings. 97. Worker named Alan Wilkie claimed to have seen a full-bodied apparition walk straight through a solid backstage wall. Why does Federici remain? Some speculate it is because he died in character, forever trapped between the world of the play and the world of the living. This is a story of a modern haunting rooted in a single, dramatic moment. But it prompts us to ask, what of places where the hauntings are less personal, more chaotic, and tied to the very ground they stand on? Answer lies in a sprawling brick building in the New South Wales town of Junee. The Junee Railway Roundhouse, constructed in the 1940s, is a cathedral to the age of steam, structure where locomotives were once repaired and housed. It is a museum, but workers and visitors speak of ongoing, intelligent activity that defies explanation. Tools are moved from one bench to another when no one is looking. Clear and distinct, call out the names of specific workers echoing in the vast, empty space. Dart between the silent hulks of old trains, and cold spots materialize without cause. Roundhouse manager David Thompson has documented countless incidents, including one where a set of heavy wrenches was found neatly arranged in a circle in the center of the floor, after the building had been locked up for the night. Paranormal investigator and author John Pinkney, who visited the site, in his book Australia's Haunted History, that the activity might be linked to the land itself, which was once part of the traditional country of the Wiradjuri people. To disturbances be a manifestation of displaced ancestral spirits, or are they the residues of the hard labor, the accidents, and the sheer human effort that went into maintaining these iron giants? Between land and haunting is a thread we must pull on, but remember, it is a thread that leads us deeper into a maze of mysteries. Only the beginning. Consider the many hospitals across Australia, places of healing that have also become repositories for trauma. Old Royal Adelaide Hospital, for instance, is famed for the ghost of a nurse known as Sister Elizabeth. To patrol the now abandoned corridors, her footsteps echoing on the linoleum. More chilling are the stories from the former Coast Hospital in Sydney, now the Prince Henry Hospital site, pox epidemic of 1880. Thousands suffered and died. To the old cemetery and ruins report hearing mass coughing, moaning, and the sound of old wagons, if the epidemic itself is still playing out on a loop. These modern hauntings in public buildings force us to confront an uncomfortable idea that our cities are built upon layers of history, that history refuses to stay buried. But what of the theatres beyond Melbourne? The Capitol Theatre in Sydney, for example, is said to be haunted by the ghost of a young ballerina who fell to her death from the Fly Tower in the 1920s. Stage technicians have reported feeling gentle tugs on their clothing and hearing the faint sound of piano music from empty rehearsal rooms. Each of these stories is a piece of a larger puzzle that suggests haunting is not a random occurrence, but a phenomenon deeply intertwined with emotion, tragedy, and place. Hold that thought, because we need to revisit the ancient warnings. Elders have long said that disturbing sacred ground invites misfortune. The phenomena at the Junee Roundhouse, or even the Princess Theatre, be a form of spiritual backlash, consequence of building on land that was never meant to be disturbed. Anthropologist Deborah Bird Rose, in her work with Aboriginal communities in the Northern Territory, writes about country as a living entity that feels and remembers. Is wounded, she explains, it can respond. This is not a metaphor, but a reality acknowledged in thousands of years of oral tradition. When workers at a modern site hear their names called by unseen voices, is it the ghost of a past laborer, or is it the land itself? Speaking through the echoes of those who came before. With two open loops, the question of ancient spiritual energy influencing modern sites, the mystery of why some tragedies create such potent, lasting echoes, will tighten in our final descent. But before we go there, let us linger for a moment on the sheer weight of these stories. From the Dreamtime narratives of the Quincan spirits to the ghost of Federacy taking his eternal seat, we see a continuum of belief and experience. Continuum that challenges our modern skepticism and asks us to listen, truly listen, to the stories of the land and its people. The Haunting of Australia is not just a collection of ghost stories. It is a dialogue between the oldest culture on Earth and the new arrivals, written in fear, reverence, and unexplained phenomena. Stand at this crossroads, one thing becomes clear: the past is never truly dead. It whispers in the tools that move by themselves, It watches from a theater seat, calls our names from the shadows of places we thought we understood. In the final part of our journey, we will confront the most terrifying possibility of all, that some hauntings are not just echoes of the past that are still happening over and over again, trapped in a loop of eternal recurrence, waiting for us to step inside. So we arrive at the final frontier, the place where stories meet science, or at least the strange tools we use to measure the immeasurable. Listened to the testimonies, felt the chill of the history. We must ask, what evidence remains when the feeling fades and the witness goes home? The domain of the paranormal investigator, armed not with sage and ritual, but with electromagnetic field meters, digital voice recorders, imaging cameras, is to capture a whisper from the other side, a silhouette of the unseen, a data point in the vast unknown. And in Australia, they have found some of the most compelling and disturbing evidence on the planet. We must remember, the evidence is never just a blip on a screen. It is the echo of everything we have already heard. The colonial violence, the lonely deaths, the ancient spiritual presences, all condensed into a moment of inexplicable sound or light. Only the beginning. 1990s, a team led by renowned investigator and author John Pinkney conducted a landmark study at the Adelaide Arcade, an array of equipment into the silent. Polished halls after midnight. What they captured would become some of the most famous electronic voice phenomena, or EVP, recordings in Australian paranormal history. On a digital recorder left running near the old spiral staircase where the shopkeeper fell to his death, a clear, plaintive voice was later discovered on the otherwise blank tape. Single word help. No one present had spoken. In another session, a question was asked into the empty air, "What is your name?" When the audio was enhanced, was a raspy, guttural whisper that seemed to say Francis, possibly referring to Francis Clooney, proprietor who died in the arcade. Were not the vague, staticky noises often dismissed as imagination. They were intelligent, responsive, and chillingly clear. But here is where it gets worse. At the Monte Cristo homestead in Junee, investigators have documented radical temperature drops that coincide with feelings of dread, so sharp and localized they register on thermal cameras as blue patches of cold in a warm room. Investigation, a motion-activated camera set up in the old nursery, where a child reportedly died, captured a brief figure moving past the doorway. Person was in that wing of the house at the time. The figure did not walk, it glided, and then it was gone. Are the moments that transform a haunting from a story into a tangible and terrifying event. Now consider the quarantine station in Sydney. Q Station, it is a hotspot for paranormal activity with over 300 documented reports. Study published in the Journal of the Society for Psychical Research detailed an investigation there using controlled trigger objects. Small period specific items like a child's marble were placed in a reportedly active room. Cameras monitored them continuously. On multiple occasions, the marble was found several feet from its original position with no natural explanation, like vibration or draft. Showed nothing, but the object had moved. Phenomenon of object manipulation of the physical world being interacted with by an unseen force is one of the holy grails of paranormal research, and in Australia, it happens with alarming regularity. Remember that marble, because the idea of things being moved by unseen hands comes back later in the worst possible way. The tools of the investigator often reveal a layer of activity invisible to the human eye. Thermal imaging cameras at the historic Beechworth Asylum have recorded human-shaped heat signatures in locked and empty cells. Electromagnetic field meters at the old Melbourne Gaol spike erratically near the site of Ned Kelly's gallows, suggesting a massive, fleeting energy surge where none should exist. But perhaps the most profound evidence comes not from machines, but from the human body itself. Sensitives and mediums brought into locations like the Kapunda mine in South Africa, site of numerous mining tragedies, often report identical sensations, the same smells of damp earth and rot, the same feeling of being pushed. Vision of a man in a torn work shirt without ever being briefed on the history. Consistency across unrelated witnesses points to a shared experience, a haunting that imprints itself on the environment in a way that some people can consistently perceive. Why is Australia such a fertile ground for this kind of phenomena? The evidence suggests it is the unique and terrifying cocktail of factors that define this land. The violence of its colonial past was compressed and intense. Massacres of indigenous people, brutal penal settlements, gold rush tragedies, pioneer hardships created countless pockets of sudden, traumatic death. Parapsychologists often theorize that emotional trauma can, in some way we do not understand, imprint on a location. Australia, White Century, was a factory of trauma. The profound isolation in a remote homestead, a suicide in a lone prison cell, a miner crushed deep in a tunnel far from help, occurred in places devoid of witnesses, where the echo of a final scream might, just might, nowhere else to go but into the very bricks and timber. And perhaps most importantly, the ancient spiritual landscape of the First Nations people. For over 60,000 years, has been understood as alive, sentient, and inhabited by spirit beings. Of a place being spiritually active is not a superstition here. It is a foundational truth. When European settlers built over sacred sites, burial grounds, and dreamtime paths, they were not just building on dirt, they were building on a living, spiritual network. They were inviting a collision of worlds. Of Australia may be in part, the land itself reacting, or the old spirits refusing to leave, or the new ghosts of the invaders becoming trapped in a spiritual reality they never understood. This is a theory proposed by anthropologists like Professor John Cameron, the intersection of indigenous belief systems and paranormal reports. The land itself, he suggests, remembers. Memory can manifest in ways our technology is just beginning to glimpse. Let us examine one final, unsettling case that brings all these elements together: the Devil's Pool at Babinda in Queensland. A beautiful, deadly waterhole, and according to local Udingi tradition, it is guarded by the spirit of a woman named Olina. Tells of her tragic death there after losing her love. Said she lures men to their deaths. The empirical evidence is grim. 20 young men, almost all tourists unfamiliar with the legend, have drowned there in strange circumstances since the 1950s. They were strong swimmers, they were in calm water, yet they were pulled under. Official inquests cite slippery rocks and unexpected currents. But the pattern is undeniable, and the correlation with the ancient story is chilling. Paranormal investigators recording at the site have captured desperate, watery whispers on EVP, of light moving against the flow of the water. Here the evidence is not just a recording, it is a body count, a pattern of tragedy that aligns perfectly with a thousands-year-old spiritual warning. That some hauntings are not passive recordings of the past, but active, intelligent, and dangerous forces. To the terrifying possibility we mentioned earlier, the loop of eternal recurrence. Compelling evidence from across Australia points not to simple, repeating residual echoes, like a ghostly video on replay, intelligent hauntings that interact and adapt. In the Adelaide arcade that answered a question, the cold spot at Monte Cristo that forms only when someone feels watched, object that moves when requested, suggest awareness, a consciousness operating from a place beyond our own. It implies that some souls, or some impressions, trapped, they are present. They are watching the investigators write back. They are listening to our questions. They choose to answer. As our journey across this haunted continent ends, we are left not with a simple answer, profound and unsettling question. The stories, the history, and the ancient wisdom of the land all weave together into a single, inescapable tapestry. Is haunted, in its old buildings and lonely roads, but in its very soul. The haunting is the memory of stolen land. It is the cry of the convict in the dark. It is the eternal grief of a pioneer mother. And it is the ancient song of the Dreamtime, all resonating on a frequency we are only beginning to hear. Our tools give us glimpses, our stories give us meaning, but the full truth remains just out of reach, lingering in the corner of a thermal image, hiding in the static of a recording, watching us from the shadows we pretend are empty. The ultimate conclusion is this: to walk in Australia is to walk on a land of layers. Layer is modern, sunlit, and vibrant. But scratch that surface, and you find the colonial layer, heavy with pain and injustice. Scratch deeper, and you find the oldest living culture on Earth, a layer of spiritual understanding so deep it forms the bedrock of reality here. The phenomena, the evidence, they are the points where these layers wear thin, and something from underneath bleeds through. They are reminders that the past is not a story in a book. It is a living, breathing, and sometimes screaming part of the present. So the next time you feel a sudden chill in a historic building, or hear an unexplained whisper in the night, or see a shadow move with no source, the weight of this land. Remember the Quincan spirits in their caves. Remember Federici taking his bow. Remember the lonely women of the homesteads. The ancient call of Olina from her watery grave. Part of the story, a story of terror, yes, but also a story of memory, of culture, and of a land that never, ever forgets. Is Australia the most haunted continent on Earth, and its ghosts are not going anywhere. They are waiting for us to listen. That was Australia's Haunted History, Echoes from the Land That Never Forgets. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this documentary, subscribe to our channel for more. We bring you fascinating documentaries on history, science, civilizations, mysteries, stories that shaped our world. Hit the bell icon so you never miss a new release. Until next time.